розпочинати наш захід.
Greetings to everyone. Greetings to our guests and the audience. We are starting our open discussion, Land of Communities, why United Communities cannot use their right to use land, because the land resource is the main source for the development of the economy and for developing the budget. There are now several drafts in the Verkhovna Rada related to these issues. And today we invited our guest experts to discuss several issues. For what do the local councils have rights? Maybe there are things that they do not do because they don't know about that. Or maybe the reason is different. Maybe they see the resistance of the governmental authorities. Whether that's true or not, we'll request to discuss it. And I would like to introduce our guest, Lyubov, Moldovan, Institute of Economics and Forecasting, Lyubov Fursenko from the Association of Rural Councils, Yurii Hanushchak, expert of the Project Office for Sectoral Decentralization, Sergii Kubakh, expert on land issues of USAID project, Sergii Bilenko, expert of the Reform Support Office, and Vyshnyov, Director General of SETAM company. And it has the functions of transferring the state lands for lease via auctions. So I suggest the following format. First, I will request everyone to take 5 to 7 minutes to talk about what the communities have right for, what they are not using, and after that we will switch to discussion. So, Lyubov, let's start from you. I'm not the specialist on communities. I'm an expert on land issues. We're talking about land issues because the right to dispose of owned land by communities is the key one. Some communities say that they don't have this right. What is the analysis, your analysis of the situation in the process of privatization of agricultural lands? The communities had only 0.3%. The rest of land is in private ownership. The former members of collective farms have owned the land, and there are some state-owned lands. What is important for rural communities is not just the land that they dispose of, but the land which is privately owned, because the community is created by people who produce agricultural products. Let's take any other country. Even though there are fewer farmers in rural areas than other layers of population, but they are considered to be such that are creating communities. The rest of people, they provide service to farmers. If there's a school, a hospital, a shop there, and big number of people who are members of the community, but they're not related to production in the village. They work outside of the village. For a rural community, it is very important to know who uses private lands. Because today we see that people who live in the village and who are the owners of land plots, they do not use them. They rent them out to companies which are not in the village, and that creates many problems, and that contradicts the theory of agricultural science, the theory on use of agricultural land. The land is not considered only as the economic category, which is apart from agriculture. Agriculture has been recognized by the world global practices as the sector of multifunctional use. The land cannot exercise any other function. It should exercise economic, social, and environmental function. Everything that we hear is around only one function, economic function of the land, but social function stays apart as well as economic. And I believe that we will mention that later. We'll talk about that later. So I will give you some data on what is the result of the situation when we do not take into account the social and environmental issues. So you believe that besides the purely economic issues, we need to add some other aspects, social and environmental. Ivan Fursenko, what's your position? I would like to add. Basically, the European practice shows that, for example, in Germany, one farmer that works on his land is tied up to 12 other people who live there. These are people in the servicing sector, when we are talking about construction of roads. And we state that one job on a road gives jobs to people in 8 other sectors, and the farmer also is tied up to other jobs. When we are talking about introducing the land market in Ukraine, well, today we don't have the policy on what we believe the land market should be. We need to think about development of agro holdings with high value added, involving minimum human resources. That's how Brazil was developing, where the agricultural companies have plenty of land, but they don't need a lot of workers. There's another process in Poland where the population moves to live to villages. There's urbanization taking place, and the state gives subsidies to farmers. And Poland divides such people into 3 categories. I work, my family works on our land, we pay minimum taxes, we get subsidies from the state. The second tax group, if this family starts hiring other workers. And the third one, if the owner of the land is in the city and uses the hired labor. So he's paying taxes just like other companies of non-agricultural sector pay. We need to identify the vector of the development of agricultural sector of Ukraine. Why do we need to do it? First, we need to open the land market. What should be compensation mechanism? I'm sorry for interrupting you. I would like to focus our discussion on around land issues in the context of communities. The communities that live on land now, at the initiative of some people, they need to receive more powers. Some people say that that could lead to corruption. That's the key issue of our meeting today. I will explain why I start from that. If communities get powers to dispose of the land in case if the state of Ukraine defines the development, the direction of the development of large companies, it will be worthless discussing the role of communities, because all the lands will be owned by some big companies. In European countries, the average land plot is 50 hectares, but in our case, even those who have 200, 300 hectares, they cannot even go to local administration. Do I understand you correctly? You believe that if there's no state strategy in the sphere of land management, then the communities will not have all the necessary powers. There's no understanding of the state policy of behavior of agricultural sector, and that's the precondition to define land rights of the local communities as to local governance. We need to understand how land plots should be consolidated. Talking about permits or sale is impossible because we do not understand where is whose land. Most people, they complain that I have a land plot from that point to that point. Who's the owner? We don't know. And there's no mechanism of influencing it. Local self-governance cannot, according to the legislation, conduct such inventory to understand where different plots, who needs to provide services, and I believe that many use the field roads, and that is why there are many critical issues which are to be addressed. They could be addressed without attracting state support.
I would like to give the floor to Mr. Hanushchak, then Mr. Vyshnyov, and then all the rest. Will you please focus on the issue of land relations and community rights? You're an expert in these issues. I will start with what Ms. Moldovan mentioned, social and economic rights. All current suggestions multiply by zero even the economic component. If we wish to have economic impact, the land should become the economic category. And in this situation, land lease is the worst situation. Unlike in America, unlike in Europe, when a very young person is able to get a credit with 1% interest rate, they will get access to this to land, while there is a big risk that dirty money which accumulated by but people, they will immediately go for and buy this land. We have the land stock, and we have the healthcare services pool. And when we privatize both the spheres, that dirty money will go into these two spheres. Then there are two draft laws. As soon as there's one of those laws will be passed, the law about community lands, and what can we do now? Consolidated territorial communities allocate money and make inventories of land on their own account, and this immediately allows them to raise their local community revenues. For example, Volochyska consolidated community raised its land tax revenues 4 times this year. Unfortunately, we cannot start land privatization unless the bank interest rates drop down to 4%. If you think that the community land will immediately be leased, that's not true. The local communities, local councils are interested in big tax revenues. That's why they will rent the land only to those who offer better price. The law 6403 sets 2 conditions. First is the capacities of consolidated local communities. In order to be capable to operate revenues and to get revenues, the local community should have a territory at least 200 square kilometers. Only under this, with these conditions, the consolidated community will be able to exist and operate, and then it should be able to control the land, the use of land in this community. And this should be within the mandate of local council, while the state, via geocadastre, has to observe which lands are disposed by this community. This would allow to resolve both social and economic issues. So, in order to resolve the problem with land, we have to finish the reform of local communities consolidation. Victor, what is the role of your enterprise? What could be done or should be done? First, I will answer your question about land relations. What is the role of your enterprise in the process? I would like to thank to Yurii, because he actually brought us to what I wish to say. Let us divide the issue into 2 parts: how to launch the land lease and how to project the future sales of lands. The local communities are interested in lease of land and in the sales of land at highest prices and with highest taxes. In order to reach these higher prices, we need to launch open land auctions, in particular electronic land auctions. The electronic land auctions were launched by a special law on the enforcement of court decisions. It is applied to those lands which are subject to sales in line with court ruling. So introduction of open electronic land auctions accessible to all Ukrainians would allow to prevent any abuses in sales. Another important issue is how to ensure security of that electronic computer land auctions. Now we cooperate with Geocadastre, which will prevent interference of administrator and of third parties into auctions. Of course, there is a probability of cyber attacks. This happens sometimes with new tools like the inventory of seized assets, etc. I think that for local communities, automated or computer land auctions might be a good solution, because it will allow them to involve additional funds. I think that state-of-the-art conditions for auctions would allow local communities to maximize their income. Sergii Kubakh, expert of the USAID Agriculture and Rural Development Support Project. Sergii, you work with experts, you work with local people. Could you please suggest how local communities may extend their authority over land, why this does not happen, and how it could be done? When we look at the land reform, there is a continuous issue in this area. The mandate of the state in terms of land disposal, and the mandate of local authorities in terms of land. And today's situation is different from the previous times, is that currently we have the territorial and administrative reform underway, and we have such a new player as consolidated local communities. And let us think about land as about factor for development of the local communities. The local community, consolidated local communities are established, but the the land pertaining to those communities is not registered in cadastre, then about the land beyond the borders of a settlement, of settlements. Many lands are classified as agriculture land and which are subject to state geocadastre, but the money for this, the revenues from this land, they should go to local communities. That is the function of geocadastre. They are not correlated with the local authorities, and local authorities cannot understand what lands to sell, what lands to offer in lease, etc. Mr. Hanushchak mentioned very good model, for the management of the consolidated local communities. This is good for construction, for urbanization, but the land which is available should be present in cadastre with the indication of the legal status. Currently, we face the situation when we cannot ensure development for local territorial communities only with the lands which remain within the borders of their settlements. We should think how to transfer land into municipal property. We should think about protection of land, about environmental role of that land, whether the state is able to ensure rational use and sustainable environmental approach to the lands which remain in state property. I think not. So we should keep in mind the development of social sphere. We should keep in mind the environmental issues of land, but not just economic issues. And now the mic goes to Mr. Sergii Bilenko, expert of the Reform Support Office of the Ministry of Agrarian Policy. What is done today at the level of governmental administration? Quite often we speak about opening the land market of agrarian lands. I don't think this is the main aspect. I would like to provide some historical background. Back in the Soviet Union, of course, all the land belonged to the state, but there was no case that any official would dispose the land resources either in Kiev or in Moscow. And all the land issues were under local councils, village councils, district councils. Unfortunately, that system was ruined in 2001 by the land code. all the land competence of municipal councils was limited by the borders of settlement. All the rest of lands was remained in state property, and the management over that land was assigned to government officials and bureaucrats who were appointed from the center of the country, from Kiev, which resulted in effect that local community was excluded from disposal of the lands beyond the borders of settlement. And from that moment, the use of lands became chaotic. Even those land plots which belong to the state, which are in disposal of state, they do not belong to one order. There are 5 bodies which can dispose any land plot: Geocadastre, Cabinet of Ministers, District State Administration, Oblast State Administration. That's not right. There could be one owner of the land plot and one operator of the land plot, and that's it, not more. From the moment when the land code was passed, the land vertical has been being developed. In 2013, the centralization had reached its peak, and State Committee of Lands, now the State Cadastre, Land Cadastre, became the body which held all the land rights. Now agricultural land is managed at the regional level. In reality, the representative bodies elected by people, they are fully separated from the land issues. The issue, this situation is unnatural. It resulted in a situation when lands that were used for feeding cows or goats, they now are shared by central authorities, and village communities have no space for their domestic animals.
But we cooperate with the Cultural Committee of the Verkhovna Rada. There was a compromise, and there was a compromise model developed, which lands are not transferred to ownership of territorial communities, but communities get the right to dispose of these lands. United communities have the right to register it as communal property. Besides, the responsibilities are distributed as to the state control. I'm talking about 4355. It was not, it is. This draft, okay. I wanted to sum it up. We've heard about the situation which exists in the sphere of land use. And we understand from everything that has been mentioned that territorial communities do not have any real mechanism of influence and disposal of land. The situation is not optimistic. And now I would like to hear from you what could be done and who should do it so that communities receive the right to dispose of lands, to manage lands. I will tell you what I think. In the Verkhovna Rada, there is the draft law 4355 ready for the second reading. United communities received the right to receive this land into ownership. What Mr. Hanushchak said, our communities are separated even from planning. All the planning documents, they are in the settlement. People have to define people will define it. Local authorities have to define what should be the land plot used for. They have to define the tax base and so on. As to control, I believe that you will agree, if the local community sees that someone is using the land plot without documents, they can impose a fine on this person. People will not be controlling themselves, but there are cases, many cases, when people are using hundreds of hectares without any documents. And the councils of basic level should have the right to control the use of the land which is located on their territory. Before you give the floor to Yurii Hanushchak, is 4355 on the agenda of the current session? Now we are talking about theory. Many people would like to get some practical result. We'll get the practical result when not just members of parliament who are politicians will be promoting this draft law, but the local authorities as well. Unfortunately, the councils, local councils, are not doing anything. I believe that people should be demanding it. As to agenda, it's included into the agenda of this session. There's some chance for compromise, and I believe that this issue is to be voted for during this session. By the end of this year, I believe this will be voted for. In which format, it depends on the members of parliament. Now, the same question to you, Yurii. I know that you have some calculations. Who can do what so that the communities receive the right to manage the land? Again, I would like to mention what should be happening. First, it's the document 6003 provides for the document which defines the use of land with geodesical, with geolocation. of all the land of the community. It's not within the settlement, it's all the land. And the limits finish where other limits start. And that is reflected in cadastre documents, because when passing this document, it will be important to do it this way. There should be a document, and the main document is the plan of the territory of community. And because this document is approved by the council, then it reflects who's the owner, what's the what is the use of this land. Also because there should be the state expert analysis done, then the interests of the state, they are followed, and amendments to the document are to be approved by the state expert body. On 4355, I don't know which were the amendments, but in the original form it's the bandit type law. If the amendments settle the system of balance, they could be considered. But passing this document without planning the territory is too early. First, there should be the plan. After that, the law on the rights to control. And then the issue of disposal. Disposal of lands owned by the state should dispose of such lands.
Consolidated local community. Об'єднана територіальна громада.
Характеру без тих, які
Consolidated.
Before the local authorities are set up, they cannot address these issues. First, you have to be formed. After that, you will get all the powers. The document, which is called the Plan of the Territory of Community, should reflect a fully complete image of land. But not temporary nature. In this case, we will address many different problems which exist. But first of all, administrative territorial reform. If these steps are made, I would like us to pay attention to very important thing, all the documents that we discuss, which were passed they talk about management of land resources from the point of view of economic function. Management of land from the point of view of social, environmental function is missing in the documents. management of land from economic point of view, yes, that's correct. It's about and so on. Auctions and so on. But from the point of view of social function, what do local authorities manage? From the point of view of environmental function, what should they manage? Let's turn our head towards Western countries. From environmental point of view, management means that the communities control the correct use of lands, despite the fact whether the land is private, state-owned or communal. Today we don't have this function included into regulations, and we're not talking about that. In the result, up to 80% of lands are degraded. Our black soil is of very bad quality. The deficit of humus, because the laws are not followed, the deficit, the shortage of humus reaches such a level that in 10-15 years we will kill the land. But the land, the soil is a living organism. There should be organic there. If there's no organic, what it will turn into? Let's look at Western countries. Who controls it? Local authorities have powers. And they even recall the license on if you violate all the rules of use of land. And that is controlled by local authorities, by community. Why? Because first of all, the community is interested in the land not to turn into dead land. And in 10 years we'll have this situation. Wind and water erosion. They wash out humus. No one controls that. That's only one aspect of environmental function. And now, let us mention what does it mean to control. What does it mean to control it from the social function? That's the employment of rural population, because in rural area to preserve colonization, like all the regulations write, to preserve so on and so on. They say colonization of agricultural lands could be done by employment of rural population in agriculture.
Частково державні функції утримує.
Out of 5 million in the USA, there are only 50,000 who are employed. The rest are owners of land. So, that is why in all countries there's limitation of ownership and use of agricultural land. And that is, first of all, good for the community. We're not talking about that. In order, well, but what do you believe? What amendments should be introduced into the laws? Or maybe new draft laws are to be developed which should give the communities the right to control. You are correct. And all these proposals are on the tables of every MP, of all people who work in the ministry, in the presidential administration. It's not just what the Institute did. We did a review of all draft laws, of all legislation of the planet. But the requirements to social function are ignored by everyone. By all the draft laws. One more detail. What does it mean? The auction of agricultural lands. Ask me. I was at all auctions. There are no auctions of agricultural lands because the land is sold to those who live there, who have education, who works on land, and so on. If we take 5 major limitations, then the auction between 3-4 people who have the right to buy this land. These are people who represent the community. Ivan, the question to you, please continue. Okay, you complete. If we ignore the social and environmental functions of land, if we only think about how to earn, how to sell, then in 10 years it will pay back. That is why the Americans passed the law which prohibits non-farmers to be involved in agricultural activity. There's no access of legal entities to agricultural lands. Then the society will be paying a lot for ignoring the international best practices, like Africa pays for that or Latin America pays for that. In Latin America, for 25 years they are nationalizing land to return it to peasants, and the peasants left rural areas in Brazil and in Argentina. Now the state is funding the return from the slums of the families. The families create settlements. We need to have it, to keep it in mind.
Let us ask this question to Ivan, since you represent the Association of local communities, whether the measures suggested by Professor Lyubov Moldovan, whether they will resolve the issue of efficient land disposal. You started with the international experience, how the state policy in the agrarian sector is formulated. When we pay attention at those issues which were mentioned by Ms. Moldovan, then we see that in those countries where limitations are set at the governmental level in terms of the area, education, competencies of the farmers who have access to land and who can dispose land, there, the agrarian sector is being developed. The objective of the reform is to improve quality of life of people, especially among rural population. In Ukraine, we do not have such a body which deals with the development of rural territories. In Estonia, for example, they have the ministry in rural issues, and they understand that rural issues require special approach and special solution. That's why I think best solution is to give land to those who will process it with their own hands. But another issue is with the municipal control about the seasonal change of crops in different territories, etc. So this reflects a big set of issues. So the best approach is to allow people to reside happily in the rural areas and to stimulate rural production. So here we need to decide whether we wish to have big agricultural producers or wish to have small agricultural producers, farmers, etc. Sergii, will you please express your opinion whether you agree with this statement or not? I think it is a mistake to coordinate with the local local communities development with the future market development, because territorial communities have to survive two ways. We should look at the nearest future and allow the local communities to get resources and to get money from the resources which are accessible for them. The land is a major territorial base in production of agricultural products. But via land, we get access to subsoil mineral resources, and again, this brings us back to the powers of the local community. I think that as of today, local communities have to get their land resources into disposal to make use of their lands. They should know what is located on their territories. As of now, there are a lot of bodies who may dispose land, while local communities do not know what land is on their territory, whom does it belong, what is the status of that land. So, Mr. Hanushchak left. I read the draft law 6403. There is no relation between master plans of the territory with cadastre. Irrespectively of what master plans you have, this requires a lot of time, etc. I would like to specify, if you speak exclusively about economic component, what further development for the sector we can project for the sector if now we do not think about environmental and social powers of local communities. In cadastre, we should have the community lands stock allow communities access to that land, allow them to dispose, allow communities to dispose the land. I do not think that the stand that the state I do not think that non-owners will make efficient use of land. Am I right when I understand that full right of local communities to dispose the land will allow local communities to carry out social and environmental control over that land? Here, everybody continues to create transparent and accessible access or control over land, including the territory of local communities. Whether your enterprise is able to offer such transparent control system. I think that this question should be asked to State Geocadastre, but the integration of their documentation allowed to register all the land to whom it belongs, and then further we can integrate the resources with our technologies of sales, and thus we will prevent any corruption in course of auctions. What is your assessment whether these works are efficient in Geocadastre? For us, integration is not that radical, that large scale as for State Geocadastre, but by end of July, we will fully integrate Module 1. For Geocadastre, this is bigger task, but will be able to launch the land lease mechanism by October, as it was required by the Cabinet of Ministers. What about social and economic component? Whether your land lease mechanisms allow to carry out social and environmental control. We are just a sailing frame, but the owners can install, can offer their conditions and set any conditions. So recently we started auctions of movable property. We sold several buildings in villages. For example, the social building, the ruins of social buildings is being sold. The land could be used for further residential construction. Then that building could be offered to the local community, and much will depend on those who commission the sales of land, that is, of the seller, or so you simply transfer the conditions which is offered by the landowner. Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Sergei Bilenko. Would you please comment what first line decision should be made to resolve the situation that we have today, and who has to make that decisions? I would like to mention the lease of land from October. The lease of land exists in this country for many years. It should not be launched in October. We have auctions of land functional from 2012. If I'm not mistaken, each land plot is accessible in internet. And currently those auctions are held physically. Now they are held physically, while in the future they will be held in computer. This will be more transparent. But frankly speaking, with all my respect to SETAM, this opens a way to further abuses, and any system could be abused. The auctions continue, they were, they are, and they will be. And when we look at auctions is a good option, because they bring up to 10% more money than without auctions. And about local communities, now they have nothing to sell, and we do not speak just about agricultural land.
А земельна ділянка.
А у вас ще один є. Так, ну тобто
Треба
це.
говорити конкретно.
You need to say what land are you talking about. One thing is land on the house, another one is when land is on the potato. I'm talking about all types of land. The land plots of agricultural use, they do go via auction. This cannot be done at the auction.
Економіка рухнула б, якщо б ми все сільське господарство тільки зробили ставку на місцеве.
There should be the reasonable balance. The holdings bring us a lot of foreign currency into the country. There should be a reasonable balance. There should be big companies and small farms. But I will readdress the question which people ask who live in the village. If the territory where the community is set up, 3/3 of the land are leased by anyone, then how can community influence the management of this land? And you say that we are talking about capacity of communities. Most of agricultural lands are private, and the state shouldn't interfere into what to do with this land. If a person, and the person will select the one who pays more. To say that the communities should identify the conditions, we shouldn't do that. We need to optimize the system of management of public land. There are distortions there, whether the land is given to large corporation and so on. Here the state can interfere and give some advantages to small producer or the one who will bring investments. But I believe the state shouldn't interfere into private relations. Then we are talking about the right of communities to dispose of the land which is the object, which is in state or communal ownership. And we say that a lot of land which is outside the settlement is owned by communities, and the communities should get the right to use these lands as well. Ivan, several minutes to you, and we will be wrapping up. One more thing which I would like to say. We are talking about united territorial communities, but the smallest united territorial community has about 1,000 citizens. There are some communities which have 10,000 citizens, and they can manage these land plots independently. Another thing is, as to cadastre, the state hasn't developed a single cadastre where you can see who's the owner, and these powers are to be transferred locally, so that the local communities create such cadastres, but all should be done according to one scheme, so that everyone can see which land plot is owned by who, and whether it's owned or leased, and as to coexistence of agricultural holdings and peasants. Decentralization should take place so that those people who live in rural areas improve their life. How can that be done? When the agricultural holding will pay more taxes and the farmers will pay less taxes, because now they all pay similar taxes. And there are people who produce 90% of potato, for example, they sell in the market, and they are not included. When the state differentiates this tax burden, when the state introduces limits for ownership or lease of land, then we'll be able to feel the development of rural areas. Poland, they have de-urbanization there. People go back to the village because they feel protection, and they work on land. Argentina and Brazil, that are creating agricultural holdings, they are forgetting about the quality of life. And one more thing I would like to mention, there's experience of Latvia where the lands during this primary reinstitution were bought out by pension funds of Sweden and Denmark. Now Latvia has 2,300,000 citizens, but in reality there are 1.5 million living there. They even have stadiums in the villages, but there are no people because there are no jobs, and such settlements they will disappear from the map of Latvia. The same will happen in Ukraine if we give them powers to manage lands, but if we do not implement the socially oriented policy, then people will go not to cities, but they will go work abroad, like we see it in Baltic countries. We started our discussion from the question, what can communities, what should communities rely on, who can give them powers, but now we're talking about priority of social policy in the sphere of agriculture, about introducing social markers of control. So despite that, let us define the priorities. Let us wrap up our today's meeting. I will request each one of you to say what is needed, what do we need to do, first of all, who can do it, and in which time frame. We're talking about improving the well-being of communities. We need to remember one thing. The market of agricultural lands provides for any form of change of land use is administered by the state. There's no free access, there's no free sale, there's no free accumulation, there's no free use. So if we introduced at least 56 norms which are in EU directives, which refer to the rules of use of agricultural lands, every year the farmer submits the data on the balance of humus. We're not even talking about such documents. It's all in the system of cross-compliance. We need to introduce it into our legislation. And we say there's no state interference. The state does not interfere. But as an agricultural market, the market of land should be regulated like in other countries. We have access to legislation of any country, and if we hear something that we disagree with, we open the legislation of any country and we see who has right, what is the access of foreigners, and so on. What does the state manage? With the help of all the local bodies.
The Council of Consolidated Community, it has the regulatory rights. Let us forget the phrase that the state does not interfere into private land use. We should know this, that this interference is inevitable. There was a right idea expressed here. If you do not pay attention on this, if you do not pay attention at social function, we do not pay attention at the environmental function, then the lands will be operated by people who do not reside in the village. This resulted in deserting of land in Latin America. 70% of agricultural land which were used by big agricultural companies, they had become non-acceptable for agriculture. And let us reject from another statement, if you believe that small farmers cannot sell grain, then only agri-holdings, then let us make special state holdings which will sell grain, like in Canada. So your first idea is to set the rules of the game and give the land to local communities. Ivan, what I think is needed, we should look at in the second reading to the law saying that local communities have the right to dispose lands around communities not within the boundaries of a settlement with a preserved state control. But the local communities should be capable, which have proper human capital. Sometimes when the state tries to delegate functions to local communities, they do not have capacity to take these authorities and functions. And another important aspect which now is discussed in the Cabinet of Ministers, is to create the Agency of Rural Development, which would be responsible for the rural policy in the state and think about incentives for rural residents to work on their land. Sergii, as a representative of the Ministry of Agriculture and its reform office, what do you think could be done? The land authority, the land mandate should be transferred to local communities, and I believe that this will finally happen. Of course, there is a lot of people who wish to postpone this process. Thus, the draft law 4355 remains in the parliament for 2 to 3 years now. And when we transfer the right to dispose land to local community, the biggest issue is about corruption. We all have the issues with corruption in Kiev. We know how it works. So by now we have the obsolete post-Soviet norm that each citizen of Ukraine has the right to get some land in ownership. As far as I understand, a lot of state land is taken each year. These are millions or billions of money. We have to repeal, to cancel that old post-Soviet norms. Of course, we should allow to privatize the land plots which are used for residential houses in rural areas. Of course, for politicians, this is not a rewarding thing, because for the future term, they won't be re-elected. So the situation is similar to free healthcare. It does not exist. The free healthcare does not exist, but everybody believes that it is exists. And this is the same with the agriculture. Sergii Kubakh. I've heard that the lands could be sold. This will fill in the local budget. Let us imagine that the best lands around villages will be sold, and low productive lands which become the part of the local community. What will happen to them? 60 The Constitution says that the land is a special type of resources, and it is under special protection of the state. I do not see any decentralization in the land reform. We should decentralize management of land resources in course of decentralization reform. Let's give the powers to local authorities before elections, then we will deprive them from their authorities. Then amendments to Constitution about consolidated communities. Now the Cabinet of Ministers tries to imitate decentralization in land reform, but we should pass the laws about decentralization and deregulation of land resources. Then the automation of the process is just a tool, but the corruption is under the table. The authorities of local communities should be transparent.
Is now someone working on this law of deregulation in land sphere? No, no. There's a sectoral approach. When it comes to United Territorial Communities, they are not represented. The final word is to you. The rights of communities in the sphere of management. Let's look at not the worst examples of the Southern America and Africa. Let's look at European experience. Let's try to buy land in a European country. The price will surprise you. You can lease it. All the land in England is inherited. But you can lease it out. Here, you can lease it. To give the rights to communities, that's correct. What will they do with it then? If the communities are strong, they will lease it out. If there's lack of funding, then they will be selling it partially. And whether they will sell it partially or totally depends on the community, but it should be open, not like in the 90s. Whether it's good or bad that large companies have lower costs, they will be more competitive. If you regulate how they can then invest, it would be good. If we allow the foreigners to participate, it will be bad. The main thing is to control how transfer will take place. You disagree? I'm sorry. This information is published. It's the result of the analysis of reports of large companies. Their profit in the ton of product is 40% lower than the profit of the companies, of small companies. Please look at statistical data. The same with the salary.
Ними даними треба апелювати. Немає поки що
There are no economic advantages, but one, the productivity, labor productivity is higher because of three cultures which are mechanized. Please use official data.
Хвилиночку.
Група з найбільшим землекористуванням в Сполучених Штатах Америки. 20% ферм, корпоративних в тому числі, з найбільшим землекористуванням 2400. У нас 20% з найбільшим користуванням. 24 тисячі.
Зрозуміло. Тепер я пропоную припинити тему і дискусії з приводу технології і питань економіки сільського господарства, а все ж таки спробувати підбити підсумки дискусії про право громад управляти землею. Зрештою, ми всі говорили тут про кілька ключових речей, які поки що не знаходять відображення в реальній державній політиці. Розширення повноважень територіальних громад в сфері управління землями, які знаходяться поза межами громад і населених пунктів, передача земель державної власності у комунальну власність і розробка чітких критеріїв продажу і передачі в оренду цих земель. Власне, це і може бути єдиним ефективним інструментом розширення повноважень громад і збільшення їхньої економічної привабливості і економічної самостійності. Дякую за дискусію, дякую всім, хто нас дивився і мав якісь запитання. Дякую учасникам.
Я дуже прошу конкретні документи, на які посилаєтеся.